Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Hypertrophy Past and Present. Thank you all for joining us. Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks, Jake. It's much nicer to be doing this first thing in the morning instead of last thing at night. I'm definitely not a night owl, so it's good to be back on the other side of the world.
I pretend. We all know you're a night owl. I made the joke last time that it's kind of like just playing darts on a clock of what time we're going to be doing it. So we've held true to that, and we've picked another totally random time today. So next time is probably going to be my midnight. Who knows? But bit of fun. And I'm not going to do another Reg Park program today. I was going to pretend that I was, but I didn't want to expose you to that. So I'm sure we'll have another one in the future. But today we do actually have a plan that we have talked about the author before, but it's been quite a long time. And we've only talked about one of his plans in the past, as far as I'm aware. So that is Peary Rader. Now, I gave him a little bit of a bio last time we talked about him, but basically he was the founder of Iron Man magazine, and he was the contributor, the author, the owner of Iron Man for a very long time, decades. And Iron Man was one of the most influential magazines in both the silver and golden era of bodybuilding. There was obviously a couple other competitive magazines at that time, but a lot of kind of more, I guess you would say, advanced or specialization techniques or kind of cutting edge type methods that were being used. A lot of them were coming out of Iron Man. So Peary did do some interesting work, even with things like isometric training, like he was talking about that pretty early on. He was talking about sort of rest pause and cluster type sets, similar methods we talked about last week. So a lot of more, I guess, creative type methods were coming out of some Peary's work. Now, the plan I want to talk about today, this was in one of his books, and not actually in Iron Man magazine, but in a book that he published. And it was a specialization phase. And I've mentioned in the past whether these specialization phases worked is they were usually done as part of a full body plan. So this was a leg specialization routine. And so you would add this onto your full body routine. You would take out the leg work of that full body plan, and you would add this in instead. So I'm not going to talk about the rest of the full body stuff because that would be whatever plan you were following. But this is the leg part of that plan. So it was leg specialization. It wasn't just quads or hams or glutes or whatever. It was the entire leg specialization. I believe it was published in 1955, his book, the Ironman Barbell Course book. And as was generally the case for Peary and a lot of people at this time, he was recommending full body 3 times per week. And so this plan or this specialization would have been done 3 times per week. So we've got 6 exercises, and although they do double up a little bit, you'll see what I mean. And we started with a flat foot barbell squat. We then went into a stiff leg deadlift, into a heels elevated squat. And then we went back into the stiff leg deadlift, back into the flat foot squat, and then back into the stiff leg deadlift. And that was it. Now, it's an interesting order. Like, it's not, he didn't just repeat 3 exercises, one time through and then a second time through. He changed the order up. And I think it's an interesting sort of, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it, because I think that there's some intuitive decision making in that. But as far as sets and reps goes, he did recommend about 10-ish repetitions. He was a little bit flexible with repetitions in a lot of his work. He would sort of talk about the double progression and usually starting at 10, going up to 12, and then dropping back down to 8 or 9 or 10. So there's a fair bit of flexibility there, but somewhere around the 10 repetition sort of mark. And he did say that some people may struggle doing this a 3rd time per week, and they may actually get better results doing it twice a week instead. What do you feel about that?
So I guess first thing is to notice that we do have a deadlift variation and a stiff leg deadlift variation of that, which is different from a lot of the other programs that we've looked at in the past, where for some inexplicable reason, we tended to not see those sort of types of exercise, which I always thought was strange, because it's like one of the simplest, because we're dealing with a period of time in which we don't have access to the machines and all of the equipment that we would normally associate with this kind of activity. So, it's always surprising when you look at the silver era and you're like, where are the deadlift variations? Because you've just literally got a barbell on the floor. You should be picking a barbell up off the floor. So it's cool straight away just to see that we've got that. And obviously with it being stiff leg, that's also pretty cool because, it does definitively give you that hamstrings stimulus that you wouldn't get if you started to have a bent knee, a variation where the knee is extending. You're not going to get the hamstrings really contributing very much. So straight away you can kind of look at that and go, okay, we've got a nice program that's going to have a decent chunk of the glutes and quads in from the squat side of things, and a decent chunk of, adductor magnus as well, obviously, and a decent chunk of adductor magnus and hamstrings in the stiff leg deadlift variation. So from a kind of holistic lower body point of view, yes, I can see why you might build a program around those two exercises. Now, from our perspective today, would that make the most sense? Probably not, because we've got so much more, kind of machinery that we can access, that we can, train lots of different things in different ways. We've got, a lot more understanding of how the lower body is going to respond to, those different exercises separately. But ultimately, I think if you were to just sort of start with, how can I sort of build a program based on a couple of barbell exercises, that would probably be a really good start. Now, if I were writing it today, they would say to me, you literally just got a barbell and you've got to write a program for the lower body. I would probably have a hip thrust or a glute bridge in there as well. But, fundamentally squat, stiff leg deadlift and hip thrust, I think would be fantastic as a lower body kind of program built around barbell exercises. Obviously, still those two is a really good kind of step in the right direction. But I'm interested to see why you think that the ordering makes a difference, because I'm not seeing that.
So what stands out to me there, because initially when I saw it, I was like, man, you've kind of made this confusing for the sake of being confusing. Why
Yeah,
not
that's
just
what I
repeat
think.
it? Yeah. But what we've got, so we've got the flat foot squat twice. We've got the heels elevated squat once.
Yeah.
And then we've got this stiff leg deadlift 3 times. So it's interesting that we've got one variation for the hams, and that hamstring exercise is getting repeated a third time. But because we've got 2 quad exercises, we're doing one of them twice and the other one once. So he still managed to evenly split the volume, the 6 sets across both hams and quads, by making the exercise weighting uneven, if that makes sense.
I mean, I would be interested to hear what you think is happening with the change in the foot position on the squat, because my gut feel, and I don't think there's a lot of data on this, but my gut feel is that, you know, it's not changing a lot, really. I mean, it might change the relative involvement of the hips and the knees a little bit, depending on the resulting position that you end up with. Do you have an image of that?
I don't, because he used sketches and they were not necessarily that
Did he
helpful.
describe it at all any
Oh,
more
you
than
put
he?
me on the spot here. I don't have the description in front of
Okay.
me. I'll come back to you on that one. Unfortunately, it'll be a part 2. I do know the image I have in my mind of his little sketches are that the elevated squat was very low. And I do believe he made the instruction to go effectively as low as you can without your lumbar grounding. Now, I forget how deep he was suggesting the flat foot squat, but that's my understanding with the heels elevated, was that would be a very sort of deep squat.
Possibly more knee dominant then. So,
And
I mean, generally,
actually,
that's
my
why people do
recollection
it.
as well is his heels were together, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, my gut feel is that type of squat was targeting more quadriceps and less hip extensors. That's my gut feel. So you could argue, it might be something equivalent to dropping between a back squat, or alternating between a back squat and a front squat, or something like
Yeah.
that. It's kind of, the idea is that you kind of shifting a little bit from hip extensors to knee extensors. Now, honestly, I don't think that. Well, I think for most people, most of the time, the back squat is still going to be a knee extensor dominant movement, no matter what you do. And I think there are situations in which people can turn it into a hip extensor dominant movement, just about, but I think it's borderline. So honestly, I don't see an enormous difference between those exercises.
Do you not think, so even if that's true, by doing the heels elevated squat, if it was, he would say he was keeping the torso very vertical and there was like a lot of knee bend in that
Sure,
exercise,
sure.
will he be potentially getting less glute than he would be doing in how we would assume he would be performing a flat foot squat?
I'm not sure whether I would say less glute specifically, but I think it's likely that there would be a ratio difference, definitively a ratio difference of hip extensor to knee extensor between those two squat variations. Yes, I think you get more knee extensor to hip extensor ratio in the heels elevated squat than you would do in the back squat, the standard back squat.
So if that heels elevated squat were another flat foot variation, considering he's got multiple sets of a hinge movement in there,
Yeah.
could it tip one over the edge a little bit?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is I don't think it's gonna make that much difference either way. Honestly, given that he's doing a hinge variation anyway, I would probably back off on the hip extensor dominant squat variation. I would probably just move towards a more knee dominant
Yeah,
squat
so he could have
variation.
actually done more of the heels
Yeah,
elevated and feel yeah,
and
but
actually
doing
that
at least
would probably
one would
make
be better
more
than
sense. Yeah,
yeah,
sure. It would make more sense because you would probably use less load for a deeper squat, which is very beneficial situation for those guys who are operating with minimal kind of equipment and, having to use lighter loads in order to be able to
yeah.
get the barbell in place and those kind of things. So, I think practically speaking, it would make more sense to me to just go all in on the deeper squat, which is more quadriceps dominant with the heels elevated or front variation or whatever you want to do and separate the two out and push in different directions. And I think ultimately that's kind of what we've always been talking about with neuromechanical matching, with exercise selection. It's like this idea of, you know, figure out what it is you're trying to train with the exercise and go all in on that thing because that'll get you the best results for what you're actually doing. You start spreading out the stimulus across larger parts of the body, you're not going to get, especially when you're already training those other parts of the body with another exercise,
Well,
you're
that's
not
that's the
you're not
assumption,
going to
right?
get
If you
the yeah.
weren't doing that, then it could make sense. Like, I like the idea of having a back squat in, even if you were then to have a leg extension or something that's a little bit more quad, sort of more isolated, because you are getting that broad stimulus and you're kind of getting that, diffuse stimulus for parts of, even for lumbar or for whatever that you might not be getting that
Well, this
stimulus
is
for otherwise.
this is a question that you and I have talked about offline a number of times, which is this idea of saying, you've got the purpose of the exercise, which is a particular muscle group or even a muscle within a muscle group. You do that exercise for that purpose. But then some exercises, like the squat especially, and the deadlift, rack pulls, things like that, they train other stuff that we don't talk about because it's not like a clearly defined muscle group that we're kind of targeting. It's just kind of like somewhere else. Like you're standing there with this ridiculous weight on your back or you're pulling a ridiculous weight off the floor. There's stuff being trained there that you don't see on your list of muscle groups that you're targeting. And I think that's a really interesting point. And I know you've done some kind of anecdotal or data collection on yourself on that. In the way you're saying, well, if I take squat out of my routine, how does that change my body composition? How does that change the way I look? I think that's really, really interesting kind of ideas where you're saying, look, just standing under that ridiculously heavy barbell puts a hypertrophic stimulus on small muscle areas that we just don't list out on our target muscle groups for the purposes of bodybuilding training, but it still creates muscle mass increases over time. And you see these little lean mass increases, which you can't really pin down to being in one of your major muscle groups that you're training. And it's literally just because that exercise places large chunks of the body under load that aren't necessarily, kind of clearly definable parts of the body that we're training for bodybuilding. And I think it's really, really interesting kind of idea where you say, yes, on the one hand, we are training, specific muscles and isolating is the wrong word, but targeting that with specific exercises that do specific things is usually the best approach for the purpose of growing that muscle. But equally, if you're talking about whole body muscle mass increments, that's a separate question. That's where you might want to just have one or two of these big kind of exercises in there if that's your goal. But again, are you targeting shape? Are you targeting muscle mass? Or are you targeting a particular look? Or are you just literally wanting more mass overall? These are separate questions. Everybody's got to answer their own question for their own purposes.
Yeah, it's almost the fact that an exercise like a squat, for example, a back squat, the fact that it's not the best quad builder is exactly, in my opinion, what makes it a valuable exercise, or a deadlift variation. The fact that it's not necessarily the best hamstrings or whatever is what makes it valuable because you're getting that diffuse stimulus. And I think that one critique I would have of how I see a lot of quote unquote science-based lifting nowadays setting out programs is a lot of the time there is an emphasis on these, just purely single joint exercises, unilateral exercises, exercises that are using quite minimal loads. And there's sort of overlooking, I guess, some of these more multi-joint exercises or these exercises like you've explained that might just be actually providing a stimulus to muscles we're not actually thinking about.
Totally. I mean, there's obviously a lot more muscles in the body than we tend to list out when we're doing bodybuilding training. But again, I mean, you can get around a lot of that by better exercise variety, which is something we'll come back to later on. It's just, it's just a very useful kind of, and this is something that I do a lot when we're talking about problems and trying to analyze them. It's just trying to widen the perspective and go, am I seeing the entirety of this problem, or am I just kind of, only looking at a tiny part of it? And I think what we're just doing here is trying to widen our perspective briefly, take a step back and go, what is the bigger, kind of sort of perspective here? And talking about squats in this context is a really great example of how we can widen our perspective and go, yes, we tend to talk about training specific muscles and the best ways to do that, and that's totally valid. But that doesn't mean that something like a squat with a more diffuse stimulus isn't doing something interesting that's worth thinking about. I'm never going to argue that the squat is a better exercise for training the quadriceps than something that has less total muscle mass. You're just not going to get there because the motor accumulator levels aren't going to be high enough to compete. But it's still doing something interesting from a different perspective. But again, depending on the person. If somebody has a particular look that they're going after and that diffuse kind of stimulus doesn't serve that look, then it's not going to work for them. Whereas if somebody is literally just going, well, I don't really care about the look. I want the muscle mass across the whole body, and that's what I am interested in. Then something like a squat is really interesting to include in your routine because it's going to sort of get parts that other exercises can't reach. It's just going to kind of sort of load things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to load. I think a rack pull probably does something similar, but from the opposite kind of loading direction.
Yeah, those are the two exercises I use in my plans for that purpose. And I'll normally include at least one, often I'll include both. My personal favorite weighted program, and a lot of my plans reflect this, is to have, if I say I'm doing full body AB, to have one day which is all just those single joint exercises and another day which is basically just these multi-joint exercises. I think that's the best of both worlds. And for me, looking at it, it's kind of very Reg Park combined with Steve Reeves. Steve, we've talked about his plan where it was multiple exercises per muscle, single set. A lot of it was biasing particular parts of a muscle. And then we look at a lot of Reg's stuff, and a lot of it's, behind the neck pressing and bench pressing and squatting and these big multi-joint exercises. And I think, hey, if we take both, mash them together, I think we've got a pretty good plan.
Yeah, again, depending on what your particular goals are, because I think the look will be slightly different. I think, but ultimately, it's just again about just saying what physiologically is happening, and then what do I want, and then putting those two things together, and letting the physiological reality serve the goals that you're trying to achieve. But yeah, just widening our perspective and trying to sort of see what the possibilities are that are available to us.
The last point I wanted to make in this plan is I would have loved for one of those stiff leg deadlifts to be Romanian deadlift. If we had that, I'd be quite happy. And you're kind of not shaking your head, but you're not sold on that.
Well,
tell me why.
I'm not sold. The reason I'm not sold on it is I'm always a bit so. Before we came on the podcast, we were just talking through a whole range of different ideas of what we could talk about, and not necessarily in this podcast, but in future podcasts. And we've got lots of interesting things floating around in terms of ideas and topics that we've been working on talking about. And one of the topics that we've got lined up as something to talk about is this idea that multi-joint exercises often have a certain amount of variability in them about where the stimulus is actually going to end up. And that can vary between people, and it just kind of is one of those features of neuromechanical matching. And for me, when I look at the RDL, I'm always kind of a bit uncertain about where the stimulus is going to go. And so straight away, I'm like, is that a reliable exercise that does the same thing in every person? No, it's not. It's going to do something different in different people. The back squat is kind of like an RDL, but a little bit more reliable in the sense that you kind of know where the stimulus is going to go. It's going to go to the quadriceps and the adductor magnus and the glutes. And it's kind of, yes, you're going to get a quadriceps stimulus as your priority in most people most of the time, probably not in everybody all the time, but most people most of the time is going to be priority. Your limiting factors in with the quadriceps. And then you can have the adductor magnus being the primary hip extensor, and the glute is just going to kind of help where it can. And that's going to be more or less applicable for all people. RDL, I'm like, well, yeah, it's going to be some adductor magnus, then you're going to have some glute in there, and then do I get a bit of hamstrings or not? Probably not, and maybe I might see it at some parts of the movement. And then there's some quad in there as I'm starting to stand up, and it's just messy. And again, it's like, is that messiness, that diffuse nature, something you want? Okay. Or is it something that I don't want? My gut feel is that a stiff leg is almost always better. And the reason I'm going to argue that, finally, my key point there is that I don't think that you're going to get so much more load on your RDL to make it worth not doing a stiff leg. Because, I mean, that's where you're going to go with it. It's going to be like, if I can do much more load on the RDL, that justifies me doing that for the overall diffuse nature. And
I don't think you're going to get much more load either. No, I don't.
Whereas if
I
you were
don't
to
think
argue rack pull with me, then I would be a much less vociferous, because with a rack pull, you can go crazy. You can put some silly weight on the bar with a rack pull, and then you're going to get some really interesting diffuse stimulus. Whereas the RDL is not so much more in terms of absolute load than the stiff leg. I'm just thinking of what my numbers were, and I don't think I would be more than 10 kilos more on an RDL compared to a stiff leg, maybe a little bit more. Not so much that it would be really visible, like noticeable. Whereas rack pull, you're just jumping up in terms of loading, and so suddenly your diffuse stimulus is just way higher than it would be. So if you want to make the case for rack pull versus stiff leg, I'm all ears, but I don't think the RDL is that much better.
No, I agree with that. That wasn't going to be my logic with that. And I agree with what you said there about about the rack pull. My preference in any of these hinging exercises is actually a stiff leg rack pull. And again, I use that for the purpose of this diffuse stimulus, but also getting a decent hamstring stimulus. But the point I was going to make is we've got multiple sets anyway. We've got multiple sets of the stiff leg. And if we're going to do these, you're laughing. We can all hear you laughing.
I'm laughing because it's like you kind of like a stiff leg rack pull. It's like you want it all. It's like I want all of the possibilities in one exercise. It's like not content.
Such a good exercise, in my opinion. Huge fan, and I don't know why people don't do it more. But my argument with this would be, if we're going to do multiple sets, as you've just pointed out there, okay, the RDL not reliably getting much hamstring work. Yeah, okay, maybe some depending on the person, whatever, but it's not as reliable. The stiff leg obviously is going to be more reliable. Now, if we're taking some of that hamstring work from this stiff leg and we're taking it out in the RDL, well, that central motor command is going somewhere. So I'm not looking at it saying, well, it's reliably a glute builder or reliably whatever. I'm looking at it saying, well, it's got to be doing something that the stiff leg isn't necessarily doing. And if we've got these sets to play with, are we going to get more bang for buck by adding a third set of a stiff leg or by adding one set of an RDL?
But again, if you're arguing it literally and those are my only options, then I agree with you. But I really don't think those are the only options.
But hip thrusts didn't exist at this point.
Sure, but rack pulls did. And I think rack pull would be my preference.
I think that would probably be an equipment thing because they would be having to do that off blocks.
Sure.
But yeah, no, that's fair.
So I would say, today I would absolutely have the hip thrust and maybe the rack pull as
today it would look quite
variety.
Different.
Yeah, and if you're just going to go back there, then I still think a rack pull would be better than an RDL for the purposes. But again, I agree with you. If your only options are either don't do the RDL and just do stiff legs or do the RDL, then I would say, yes, you're probably right. A little bit more variety is going to be better than just continuing to do the same thing all the time. I agree.
And again, as you pointed out, there's not a lot of load difference. So for me, it's like, well, hang on, you don't even need to change the setup. You just do the same thing. You pick up the bar and you just bend your knee or you don't bend your knee. So you don't need blocks. You don't need a rack. You don't need anything else. That's why I would look at that and think, just why wouldn't you do that?
Why wouldn't you do that? Yes, he could have done that on the middle one so that it was pairing with the deep, kind of squat, and it would have had more symmetry in the program and been more aesthetically pleasing to look at. Yeah, no, I get it. It's just, I guess for people listening to this, the point here is that what we're trying to do is understand how physiology is changing the out of the training program or the workout that we're doing. We're not trying to bring dogmatic program kind of approaches to the table and argue them. We're literally just looking at what we think the exercise will do in terms of physiological reality and discuss why we think one approach might be better than another. And And I think just to repeat something that I've said recently a few times on this podcast, I don't have any objection to people arguing these ideas, making cases for different things. Sometimes people will message me on Instagram and say, I think this is, potentially the case in this particular exercise, but I've heard that you say it's not, and I don't want to upset you. And I'm like, just make the case. If you
I get that. I get people asking me that about you. Chris has said this, but
make
it's
the
like, oh,
case, it doesn't matter. Just if you think the physiology, argues in that direction, make the case. And if you're missing something, I'll tell you. But it might not be that you're missing something. You might just be making a good case for, because physiology is messy. There's all kinds of different options. Hopefully this idea about diffuse stimulus today is making that point. Because at the moment, as we were saying a few minutes ago, a lot of people are really going to town on this idea of, localized stimulus to maximize motor unit recruitment in specific tissues, which is absolutely valid. But that doesn't mean that a diffuse stimulus doesn't give you something that other approach isn't doing. So it's all about making a case for what you think is valid, and that's totally cool as long as you're referencing valid physiology that exists, that you're not kind of making stuff up like metabolic stress. I mean, that's where we go off in a different tangent and you start talking about stuff that doesn't exist. As long as we're rooting stuff in things like motor unit recruitment and force velocity relationships and fatigue mechanisms that have been shown to exist, that's cool. And everyone can make their own cases for things that they think that's important or the other thing's more important. Fine, no problem. Just don't make stuff up. That's the key thing.
Yeah. I often get people asking me, oh, you put this exercise first, but I wanted to put this exercise first, or so-and-so said put this exercise first. Or, they'll present me with a few different options, or it'll be like, based on this and this, which one's right? And my answer is generally to them, look, there's not a right or wrong. Just explain to me why you chose that option. And if someone can't make an explanation as to why they chose that thing, that's a red flag, right? Like for me, if I'm putting an exercise first, sometimes I'll put a compound first, a multi-joint first. Sometimes I'll put an isolated exercise first, a single joint. Like there's not a black and white, this is the only way I do it. It's sometimes I'll choose to put a multi-joint last, I'll put a squat last because I know that the amount of supraspinal CNS fatigue that's going to cause is going to mess up the rest of that workout, especially if I'm doing high repetitions with it. Whereas other times I might be doing a clustered method. I know there's not going to be a whole stack of supraspinal CNS fatigue. I want to focus on motor unit recruitment. I'll put that first. It's not right or wrong, but I've got a justification as to what's happening physiologically when I do that, as opposed to someone saying, oh, I've heard one must always do this. No, just think through what's happening physiologically. And
that's it. This is the difference between having a set of dogmatic rules that's like, you must do this in this way, otherwise you're not doing it properly. It's like, well, no, it's not about rules. It's about principles. It's about physiological reality. And absolutely, the example you just gave is brilliant. It's like, yes, sometimes I might be doing a specialization for a particular muscle group, but because the exercise that I prefer to do for that particular muscle is really demanding from a cardiovascular point of view, I'm still not going to do it first in the workout because it's going to cook me for everything else that I want to do. So it's like, yes, on the one hand, I should be prioritizing it higher up my exercise order, but equally, I know that I won't get anything else done if I do that first. So it's like you've got to make a decision and say which of the variables or which of the problems or circumstances are most important to you at that particular time, or change things. I mean, again, there are other options, like we were arguing with the rack pull versus the Iptos versus the RDL. I mean, it's like there are other options available to you. And if you stand back and widen your perspective a little bit, you might see an approach that you haven't seen before. You might consider variables or factors that you haven't thought about before. And it's all just about thinking things through and referencing the physiology at each step.
Now, I feel like we could just keep talking about this and make this a topic in and of itself, but we did have a different topic we wanted to talk about. Do you want to introduce us?
Well, it's a highly related topic, really, because the idea that we had for this podcast was talking about specialization and what factors or variables we want to consider when we're talking about specialization. So essentially, when we were discussing this, I said, well, potentially we've got sort of four major variables to think about, and there's probably other things as well, but there's kind of four major variables to think about. And they kind of separate a little bit into two kind of broad categories. So on the one hand, if you're doing a specialization, you want to make progress as fast as possible. That's kind of what we want. We want motivation. We want, kind of that sort of see progress. We want to be moving forwards quickly. And we want to get to the end of the specialization phase and feel like we've accomplished something. So It's like we don't have all the time in the world for this. We want to dedicate a period of time to it. So rapid progress is the name of the game. Equally, on the other hand, we also want to reach our maximum potential for that particular muscle group. So I think we've kind of addressed this idea before. It's like the difference between rate of growth and kind of like ceiling on growth. So you've got to kind of think about these two things separately. And these training variables are kind of fit into these categories. But ultimately, on the one hand, we want to see rapid rate of growth, but on the other hand, we want to see maximum possible growth. Now, in terms of maximum possible growth, as we've said before, we want to hit the highest possible level of recruitment that we can. And we also want to hit all of the possible areas of the muscle that we're trying to train. So we don't just want to be training one particular area of a muscle repeatedly and expect to gain maximum muscle mass for that area. For that whole muscle group. We're only going to get it for that one area. So we want a large amount of exercise variety. We also want the maximum level of motor unit recruitment. Now, just to kind of link that back to what we were saying, a few minutes ago, that's kind of the approach that we're seeing a lot of on social media at the moment, where people are doing kind of 10 different exercises for a muscle group with all kind of different isometrics and, kind of partials and things like that, which is cool. I mean, it's great to see people experimenting and playing around with the neuromechanical matching ideas and the motor unit recruitment and that kind of stuff. So, the idea would be, if you want to specialize, you do need to have a really high level of variety, but biomechanically different variety. I mean, like one of my kind of examples that I give when I do the mentorship program, and I say to people, one of my great frustrations with reading bodybuilding kind of programs is where people will have 3 different biceps curls, but they're all basically the same biceps curl. They all have the exact same muscle length and joint angle, peak force and all that kind of thing. So it's like they're just changing between barbells and dumbbells and stuff like that. It's like, that's not biomechanically different exercise. You want a fundamentally different kind of exercise if you want to have true variety in your program. So a decent amount of variety. You've got high levels of recruitment. Now, again, the recruitment stuff is about minimizing muscle mass. It's about, picking your motivational techniques that you might have, whether it's training with somebody else or whether it's the music that you're playing, whatever it might be. You've got all these kind of techniques that you can kind of group into that category, and we can talk about that later on. But on the other hand, you've got stuff that's going to affect your rate of growth, which is kind of essentially your frequency and your volume. You're going to need to have reasonably high frequency if you want to make rapid growth, and you're going to need to have a decent chunk of volume in each of the sessions. Now, volume doesn't have to be for every single region. You can volumize by, like we were talking about previously in other episodes, you can volumize by having different kind of exercises for the same muscle group overall. So your volume might actually just come from your large exercise variety. But again, on the variety side, when you're looking at frequency, you wouldn't want your variety to be spread out too much across the week. You'd still want your variety to be kind of within your high frequency template. So, whether you're training every other day or whether you're training 3 times a week, you'd want your variety within workout rather than across workouts. So, we're not picking a different exercise and doing, ABC full body, as people keep asking me if they can do. And that's one of the few things I get a bit dogmatic about, where people say, can I do full body ABC if I, and then insert reasons. And I'm like, not really. It's not going to work. So, kind of want, I would say, on a specialization to have high frequency with your high recruitment and your high variety within those single workouts of your program. And actually, most of the time, that's going to take care of your volume issue, because if you're doing a decent chunk of variety, you're probably going to find that you're doing 3 or 4 exercises for the muscle group, and that's probably bringing you up against the top end of your volume, kind of workout volume, if you're using those moderate loads. So I would say that's my intro. That would be my kind of starting point as a framework for a specialization. What does that sound like to you?
It sounds great. I think that's a very helpful framework to be talking about. There's a few points there that I think you're going to touch on them anyway, but what's coming to mind for me is, and you mentioned at the start, is the goal here the speed of growth, or is it the potential or capacity of growth? And whenever I hear people talk about these specialization type phases, what's going through my mind is, are you just doing something which is giving you short-term adaptation, which you're going to lose when you then go back to whatever you were doing beforehand? And some of what you've outlined there, and I know you're going to go into more detail, has the potential to do just that, to give you a short-term adaptation while you're doing it, and then you go back and you lose it. And some of what you've outlined there has the potential to give you an adaptation that's going to persist into future phases. And I think for people who do specialization phases, this will be a helpful thing to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in terms of motor unit recruitment stuff, if we do small muscle mass exercise designed to target very specific regions, and similarly, if we do exercise variety that's designed to target specific regions, and we do those for only a short period of time. So, let's say, for example, you pick I don't know, maybe you are doing some kind of sort of single arm row or single arm pull down or something, and that gives you a level of recruitment that you can't get with a two arm version. Then when you then go back to your subsequent kind of full body routine that doesn't have those single arm variations in, you are going to lose a little bit of the level of recruitment that you would be able to achieve. You'll drop down and you'll stop getting the same level of stimulus, and you'll start to see atrophy occurring quite quickly in the muscle fibers that you're not training. The flip side to that is that by training with that higher level of recruitment, you have actually increased your level of recruitment. So, on the one hand, you're not going to lose everything, but you are going to lose something.
You took two
Now,
steps forward and one step back.
yeah. So, of course, the better approach will be to try and find a way to, kind of keep that level of recruitment by continuing to do that single limb variation. But that isn't that easy. You might have to just accept that in certain situations you are going to lose a little bit, but you've made some gains, in the interim. Now, there's all kinds of complicated ways you could try and avoid that problem, but fundamentally, most people with normal levels of motivation to find that they aren't going to want to do single limb, single joint exercises for every part of the body all the time. I'm not saying that those people don't exist. I'm sure they do exist. I'm just saying that most people aren't going to fall into that category. I certainly don't. So, and the same problem you're going to get with exercise variety. If you have some kind of very strange exercise, not strange, but uncommon exercises that you introduce into your program, and then you take them out again at the end of your specialization phase, you are then going to see loss as a result of not incorporating those things to a certain degree. Now, again, neuromechanical matching tells us that if you increase the size of a muscle or muscle region, then it will have a bigger leverage and it'll contribute more to other stuff. So if you, for example, were to do a glute specialization phase, you would find that your glute then did get involved in other stuff, not the stuff that doesn't use the glute, but it would get involved in other lower body exercises to a greater extent. So if you were to do a lot of hip thrust, single leg, glute bridge, that kind of stuff, and then you were to go and start reducing the amount of direct glute work that you did, you would find that your glute still did more in your RDLs, in your squats, in your leg presses, and other kind of things as well, simply because it now has better leverage than it did before. So you get the same carryover that you would get or do get from the recruitment improvements that you've made. You get those carrying over again into your subsequent training blocks, neuromechanical matching wise as well.
In that example, so I like that example because I look at that, say I've got a guy who can't build their chest and they're just like, no matter what I do, I bench all the time, can't build it, totally flat. What I would do in that situation is take out any kind of benching and I would do something like a pec deck. And then
Yeah.
I would
Mhm.
achieve some pec growth and then I would potentially go back to benching. And like you said, the leverage will
It
hopefully
should be
shift. And
better.
yeah,
Depends how extreme their leverages are.
yeah. Yes. Yeah. And you might modify the bench, the technique a little bit to try to make it a little bit more chest dominant, whatever. But say you got someone who they weren't limited in the development of that muscle. They just were choosing to do a specialization phase anyway. And maybe they're actually somewhat chest dominant anyway in their benching and pressing movements. Then is the change in leverage going to achieve anything really that meaningful after that specialization phase?
Interesting question. I mean, if the chest is already the limiting factor, then I don't think you would get a qualitative difference. I think it would fundamentally still be, I mean, you still would still be training the chest to pretty much the maximum extent that you can. I don't think it would change things fundamentally.
I know it sounds
Whereas,
like splitting hairs, but why I
yeah,
say that is because if you were quite developed in a particular muscle, then having that exercise variation for a short period of time might not really be doing much of anything for you.
yeah. I mean, this then again comes back to this idea of, are we talking about an exercise in which the prime mover, the limiting factor is variable or not? And the bench press is a great example of one that fundamentally is extremely variable. You
Mm.
can move around the relative activations of the three major muscle groups. So if somebody is very triceps dominant in the bench, then you can shift them possibly with some exercise variation, as you were saying, wider grips, that kind of thing, and some chest focused work, you could shift them to being chest dominant in a particular bench pressing variation as a result of a specialization phase. And that would then change what the bench press did for them, really, which is interesting because you've just changed how they're then going to respond to training. Whereas I think with other exercises, I mean, the hip thrust is the best example, really. There is no scenario in which you're going to convert a hip thrust into a quad dominant exercise. It's not going to happen. It's just not.
Yeah, and that's why, when sometimes people will be like, "Oh, I can't grow my glutes, and I've got poor mind muscle connection. I don't feel my glutes in the hip thrust, but I feel them in whatever. Should I do that instead?" And in my head, I'm like, "Well, no, because nothing else is moving that hip thrust load for you, even if you don't feel it." But conversely, you could have someone in a bench where they're like, "I don't ever feel my chest. Should I do something else?" Yeah, probably. Like that. That's actually an option or an exercise where there might not be a lot of chest stimulus for you.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this comes back to then just, is there any other data that you can gather that will help you assess what your kind of limiting factor is in exercises like the bench press? And you might want to just look at your numbers for different exercises. I mean, I always say to people, if you've got an absolutely monstrous dip strength and compared to your bench press, you're probably triceps dominant. If your overhead press,
It's the
especially
same as your bench
your
then.
overhead, like,
Yeah.
yeah, if your overhead press is getting similar numbers to your bench press, then again, you're probably delt dominant in your bench press. Whereas if you've got an amazing bench press, but your overhead press and your dip are relatively weak by comparison, you're probably chest dominant. So it's just like, can you gather some data that help you kind of benchmark where you are in terms of relative leverages? And that will then tell you probably what the exercise is doing. Another thing you can do is test your bench press variations. So like if I do a relatively close grip bench press, straight away I can, sort of I get a certain number, and then I try and move out into a wide grip bench press, and my number absolutely tanks. And it's because I'm seeing the loss of triceps involvement. So I'm a very, very triceps dominant presser. So as soon as I take my triceps out of the equation to a certain degree and limit their capacity for contribution, my bench press just absolutely drops out of the sky and just disappears to nothing. So again, you can kind of play around with these kind of tests and see what you think is likely to be the limiting factor. Not saying that these are hard and fast rules that are going to give you perfect answers every time. It's just indicative in addition to this idea of, oh, I'm not feeling this muscle. Yeah, but what do the numbers tell you about what you're capable of doing in these different exercise variations? Do the numbers tell you the same story? If you're not feeling the muscle and also the numbers tell you the same story, fantastic. But if the numbers tell you a completely different story from what you're feeling, it might just be that your brain isn't feeling it for some other reason. So that basically we kind of digressed a little bit and we started talking about what happens after a specialization phase rather than what's happening inside the specialization phase. And then that kind of spiraled into talking about exercise selection. But, when I set out the original framework, I suggested that we've got kind of the recruitment side of things and we've got plus the variety side of things, which kind of more or less direct you to where you're going to get to eventually, as you pointed out correctly, assuming you carry on doing those things. And then the alternative sort of side of things is then the volume and the frequency, which kind of determines the rate that you're progressing at. So in a specialization phase, you would never really want to kind of do what a lot of people do. And I'm going to get all kinds of messages after I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. A specialization phase does not mean doing one extra day per week while you focus on the muscle group you're interested in training. That's not a specialization phase. I mean, so many people come to me and they go, I'm doing this full body workout program 3 days a week, and then I'm going to do an extra day where I do arms. And I'm like, dude, that is not how you're going to make progress on a specialization phase. That is not going to work. Okay, it's not going to do nothing. I mean, let's just kind of be specific here. I mean, so many people kind of want to, as you pointed out earlier, make things black and white. It's like it works or it doesn't work, or it works perfectly or it doesn't work at all. No, 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 no. Like it's just not going to be the best approach. Specialization is where you as the silver era, and this is another great example of silver era bodybuilders getting there first, you integrate the specialization into your existing program. So it's like you include it in what you're already doing. You replace what you're previously doing for those muscle groups with these new exercises that are designed to give you a greater overall stimulus. Now, not just a greater overall stimulus in terms of the rate of growth for the specific muscles, but also the areas and the level of recruitment that you're achieving. So this is where you kind of come back to this idea of exercise order. We talked about this already, doing things first, and trying to kind of sort of maximize the recruitment with other techniques and maximize the variety to get everything you want to do. But then the frequency and the volume are then overlaid on top of that. So we're doing stuff as frequently as possible. So either every other day or we're doing it 3 times a week. And then again, volume wise, we want to try and push up against our limits a little bit to try and make sure we're getting the maximum possible stimulus. Now, I don't think, unless people have got very high work capacities or are extremely patient and have nothing else to do all day, that they're going to probably really hit their top levels of volume. I think that, if we're working with heavier loads or isometrics or things like that, you're probably going to run out of energy before you run out of recovery capacity, really. But with moderate or moderately heavy loads, yeah, you're probably limited to 3 or 4 sets per muscle group per session. So that's kind of the sort of the context that we tend to see the data.
Can you expand on that statement you made a moment ago? Literally just then, where you said, unless someone had all the time in the world, that they're probably not going to hit up against their maximum.
If you look at the data we've got for recovery, we've got really good data. As I say to people all the time, we've got data for certain things and we've got less data for other things. So we've got really good data for how long it takes to recover for different numbers of sets of moderately heavy loads or moderate-ish loads to failure with conventional kind of squat, leg press, bench press, that kind of thing. So mainly stretch position exercise. So you can kind of draw a line through those number of sets per workout per muscle group. And you kind of get 3 sets is recoverable within 48 hours, 5 sets recoverable within 72 hours, and blah, 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 blah. And you get a nice straight line running through those sets, right the way up to about 10 or 12 sets, taking about, 6, 7 days to recover from. We don't have the same collection of data that you can draw a line through for heavier loads. So straight away, if I were to say I'm just going to use 5 rep maxes, I don't have data that will tell me how long it takes to recover. But we know that if you use heavier, I've got a table that I did and sort of put out as an infographic ages ago, and everyone went absolutely crazy about it because it showed that you could do 20 singles and pretty much recover the following day. And that's an extreme example. Ultimately, 5 rep maxes, you do kind of see much, much higher volumes being recoverable from within 48 hours. It's not going to be 3 sets. It's going to be 5 plus.
So, okay, yeah. So you're saying if one wanted to maximize the within session stimulus, then potentially a way to do that would be doing sub 5 repetition sets. And then you could potentially
and that's before, and that's even before you start leaving a rep in reserve, which is going to help. And then maybe, again, you've got people doing isometrics, which is even less problematic than a heavy load. So, when you start scaling this stuff, and that's why we're starting to see people on social media doing like 30 sets per session of isometrics. It's like, well, because you can, have I got the patience for that? No, but I'm not in the business of trying to compete on that thing. So, this is the point. I think most people would run out of patience and motivation and energy before they ran out of recovery capacity if they started to move in that direction of using heavier loads.
And it would have to look very specific, which is
but it would have to look different from. It would look different from what we're seeing most people with most kind of training programs, which, to be fair, Silver era stuff, most of the time they're using moderately heavy loads, by which I define 6 to 10. That's kind of the zone that most of them are working in. If they go higher than that, it's an equipment issue most of the time, or whatever. It's a practical concern. But where possible, they're kind of training in that kind of moderately heavy zone. And that's kind of where, I train. That's where I see a lot of people training today. But, of course, because the physiology is allowing people to take advantage of this greater recovery capacity with heavier loads or isometrics, people are moving in that direction, which is really interesting because, again, like I've said multiple times on this podcast and before, you're using the physiology to open doors to new training opportunities. Fantastic. I think that's really interesting.
We talked about the Alan Steven plan a few weeks ago, and I think he was doing 25 repetitions, and that was with a 5 rep max, I believe. And he was doing that essentially like a cluster method type thing. So, he was basically, you would take shorter rest periods and you would do it was sort of up to the individual how many repetitions they would do. And they just had to hit the target of 25. Now, obviously, if you're doing moderate loads to get 25 maximally stimulating repetitions, we're talking at least 5 sets. That's assuming there's not even any fatigue that's occurred. Realistically, probably 6 plus sets, which just wouldn't be recoverable. Yet he was doing these 25.
Wouldn't be recoverable if we reference the moderate load data set that we've got
Mm.
from the current literature. But yeah, he's using heavier loads, and so he's not running into that issue. I don't think that most of the time, if people are programming in a way to limit fatigue, then they won't probably hit their upper session limit in terms of recoverability before they hit their energy limit in terms of just getting everything done. Unless they're literally just going to be sitting there in the gym all day, or they've got their own gym and they can just kind of do a Doug Hepburn and wander over and do an exercise and then wander back and have a drink of milk or whatever, and then whatever he was doing, I don't know, orange juice, and then wander back and do, sort of another set of something else. I mean, like, sure, if your whole day is just like playing around in your gym, then potentially that's doable. But most people are going to want to go to the gym, spend an hour doing what they want to do, and then go and do the rest of their life. And I think that's kind of where the moderate load or moderately heavy load kind of sort of silver era bodybuilding program really comes into its own, and where the kind of the other sort of stuff, which is totally valid, starts to become a little bit harder to maximize. Yeah, and that I didn't phrase that properly. What I mean is, yeah, okay, hang on. So I'm not implying that you can't, I'm not implying stimulus maximization. I'm talking about recovery capacity maximization. So it's almost an irrelevance, really. What I'm saying is that it's quite easy to bump up against your top end of your recovery capacity doing moderate loads to failure. You're going to hit that with 3 sets. You probably aren't going to hit your recovery capacity to failure. Sorry, you aren't going to hit your top end of your recovery capacity training with heavy loads, either to failure or with 1 rep in reserve or with isometrics. It's just, you just don't have time in the day or the energy to get through a whole workout where you're doing that for all your muscle groups, I don't think. Is this just a technicality? I mean, does it really mean anything? Well, I'm just pointing out that depending on how you structure the program and what approach you take, workout volume may be something that you can't really push very far, or it may be something you can actually push quite a long way.
You've made a distinction there between stimulus and
Sure.
recoverable volume. And I wasn't
Yeah.
going to push you in that earlier because I know it could be a bit of a rabbit hole, but you made that distinction yourself. So do you want to tell us why you made that distinction?
Yeah. So ultimately, I think that with moderate loads to failure training full body 3 times a week or every other day, you're going to max out your recovery capacity before you max out your stimulus. So workout stimulus probably maximizes around, I mean, this is very roughly somewhere between 6 and 10 sets per workout.
Do you
Some people
think
say
that's
8.
still the case if you were to be training with these heavier loads, lower rep sets?
So
I mean, obviously
yeah,
isometrics are hard to.
I think I do, because I think that a big chunk of that plateau is not the fatigue causing that issue. I think it's literally the stimulus saturation, because it's a really, really flat plateau at that point. So ultimately, I think that we probably don't reach that stimulus plateau when we're training with 3 sets to failure with moderate loads, as we see in the data sets that we've got. So ultimately, you're hitting a recovery maximum rather than a stimulus maximum. If you were training with heavy loads, we've seen, you can do a whole bunch of 5 rep maxes, start leaving a rep in reserve here or there, or start throwing some isometrics in, and you're probably going to hit, 6, 7, 8 sets worth of stimulus before you hit your recovery capacity limit. And so ultimately, you've kind of maxed out your stimulus really by doing that, rather than maxing out your recovery capacities. But again, that's between session recovery that I'm describing. If
That's
you
interesting. In that scenario,
right,
you've actually got junk volume.
You could end up with some junk volume, yes, absolutely, because you kind of go off the top end of your, but you're still recovering, but you've got some junk
You're
volume.
still recovering, but you've got junk volume. I've never thought about it in that end of the
Right.
extreme.
Right. But if you then start to say, well, can I do that for every single muscle group? Well, some superhumans might be able to, yeah, but I mean, that's a long way away from what I can do. You're going to find that that's just insane amount of exercises and sets and reps that you're going to need to get done is going to push you to sort of 3-hour style workouts, which, we've seen examples of in the silver era, and so like if you're doing literally nothing else and you lock your phone in a safe and don't look at it to take the social media kind of thing out of your head, then you might be able to get to a point where you can start to construct a life around the gym, I'm just kind of pushing the boundaries of the thought experiment here. But I think, the problem you're going to face is the within session fatigue, not the between session fatigue.
I think
we did a whole
session
podcast on that.
fatigue, beyond the time. I mean, I guess they're part and parcel, aren't they? But if you look at some of the, like the cluster method we talked about last week, I think it's feasible. You could use a method like that and actually get, say, 25 maximally stimulating repetitions per muscle. And sure, that might still be a 90-minute session, but I think you could probably do it sub 2 hours if you were being quite specific about, using a 5-rep max load, 30 seconds between repetitions, or however you want to do it. I think there's ways you could potentially make that a little bit more time efficient.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're starting to describe, extremely rarefied, scenarios here, which are kind of not really applicable to the vast majority of people most of the time. But, it's just interesting to just follow the physiology and see where it leads you. And as I say, I think there are people who are traveling this route already, and I've seen, kind of signs of this on social media, where people are kind of saying, well, if I can do, all these isometrics or all these heavy load sets, maybe concentric only sets, and not create, post-workout fatigue, then I can just do all of this work. And it's like, yeah, but the work starts to add up. And then you get to these 2, 3, 4-hour workouts. And it's like, well, at what point in that 2 or 3, 4-hour period did you cease to actually get high levels of recruitment because you just cooked? And again, that then comes back to this Doug Hepburn idea of splitting stuff up a lot more and taking a lot more time between sets and between exercises. And, maybe you start separating your workouts into 3 separate daily chunks, and you're doing different body parts and different
Well,
parts.
I mean, that's a good point, because we've given some examples of where people split into two. I think maybe Clancy Ross one, maybe, where he split into AM and PM, and Reg did that as well. But there are actually some silver lifters who, at least for periods of time, they would actually do a 3rd workout per day as well. And like you said, that might actually be, if you lived in the gym, if you had the time, that might be a more intelligent way of doing it.
Yeah, and again, you've got to look at, what you're doing during that day, and you want to make sure that you least damaging stuff earlier in the day, because you wouldn't want any kind of inflammatory response to kick off, even if it was a small one. I mean, if you're training in these ways to minimize post-workout fatigue, you're not expecting to create meaningful amounts of muscle damage, but you might get a little bit, say 6 to 8 hours post-workout, because the less damage you create, the earlier it kicks in. So you kind of you got to watch the time scales of these things. But yeah, you could kind of you divide your entire full body workout into 3 chunks, and you could say, we'll do the least damaging stuff first, and then the next second, and then the most damaging stuff last before you sleep. And then you should find that by the time you get back to your gym you'd have the following day off, wouldn't you? Because you'd be full body. So you'd have the whole following day to dissipate all of that. And then you start again the day afterwards. So, I think that there's ways around that. But again, we're describing extremely unusual, kind of training program here. I'm just pointing out that, this physiology-based approach to strength training is about trying to understand what's happening. It's not about, because ultimately this is the difference between, and I don't know if many people realize that they're doing this, but when the current trend is for people to call themselves science-based lifters. Now, interestingly, that's changed, because only a year or 2 ago, people were calling themselves evidence-based lifters. And that has changed. There's been a shift in terminology. And I don't know how many people who are using these terminologies realize how different those 2 things are.
Yes.
Now, I've talked about this before, I've explained this before, but I'm just going to say it again. Evidence-based approaches are what you do if you can't do science, okay? So evidence-based means basically you run a study to see what happens when you do something, and you get the answer out, and it's an outcome. It's an objective outcome. So you say, what is the evidence that X technique does Y result? And you have a bunch of people and you give them X technique and you get Y result, or you don't get Y result. That's evidence, yeah? Science is going, what does X technique actually?
That's really interesting. Essentially, I mean, evidence and outcome are almost synonymous.
Yes,
So
pretty
you
much.
could call yourself an outcome-based lifter,
Well, that's
which
what
then becomes
evidence is,
confusing,
yeah.
because then we're
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about
Yeah.
outcome
Yeah,
of
yeah,
your
yeah.
own.
Sure. But yeah, so long-term outcomes of a particular trial are your evidence. So if you look in the evidence-based medicine kind of segment, or you look in the evidence-based physiotherapy or evidence-based strength training or evidence-based, whatever you want to look at it, what all of it is doing is saying, we don't know what's happening. That's what evidence-based kind of sort of program frameworks, evidence-based frameworks say, as an assumption, I mean, they don't say it because it would be embarrassing, but they kind of assume that they don't know what's happening. They go, we don't know what's happening, so we're just going to test whether this thing has this outcome. And if it does, then we're like, oh yeah, there's evidence that this thing does this thing. Okay, so this training technique does that thing, or this training technique is better than that. So when people are talking about, for example, there was that whole period of time a while back where people were talking about range of motion in strength training, or kind of muscle length in strength training. And they're going, oh, the evidence states that longer muscle lengths are kind of give more hypertrophy than shorter muscle lengths during strength training exercises. They're literally just collecting a number of studies and going, we've got 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 studies showing that longer muscle lengths are better than shorter muscle lengths producing hypertrophy, and we're just looking at outcomes. And that's evidence-based framework for you. Science-based says, how is this thing working? What is happening? Science-based is going, well, we think that titin is producing passive tension, that's producing sarcomedogenesis, blah, 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 blah. And you basically try and figure out what's happening, and then you apply that to your situation to understand whether or not your outcome is going to be better or worse. And what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, and I've been kind of really hammering this day in, day out, is that the scientific approach is absolutely, kind of smashing the socks off evidence-based approaches for strength training at the moment. Science-based approaches are predicting what's going to happen, and they're getting you the best answer, and they're fitting with the silver era bodybuilding training programs, and everything is fitting together relatively nicely. And as a result, I think we're starting to see people talking about science, but they may not necessarily know that science is different from evidence. They may not know that a science-based framework is a completely different animal from an evidence-based framework, but it is. And it's really interesting to see people calling themselves science-based lifters and actually using physiology to understand what is happening and then predict the outcomes of a training program based on that understanding, because that's what science is. It's an understanding of how the world works. Evidence is not. It's literally just saying, well, we've noticed that this thing does this thing. It's like, well, we think that does that thing because we've seen it happen, but you don't actually know how it happens. So you could be looking at something completely irrelevant,
My observation is that people who are using this term, science-based lifting, I think they largely do understand this distinction, because what I am seeing is actually a lot of people who are claiming science-based lifting status almost depicting themselves as against or oppositional to evidence-based.
That's pretty cool. That's interesting.
Yeah, and maybe this is a bit more of a TikTok phenomenon, like it's something I'm seeing a lot there, and maybe a little bit less on Instagram. But I think people are aware that there is a distinction. And I mean, you did a podcast on this, at least a year ago, whenever it was. And that was probably the first time for me I become aware that, there is this distinction that people started to talk about. I hadn't, like you said, people weren't calling themselves science-based lifters at that point, or I don't know when it started. For me, I feel like it probably started when you and Paul did that podcast, but
Right.
I don't know if maybe that was just I was living in a cave, maybe I hadn't noticed it, but certainly has become much more popular over the last year or so.
No, that's interesting. I don't know. I mean, it is definitely a thing at the moment. Definitely seeing an enormous push in that direction of terminology. But again, not everybody may realize that there is a difference there. And not everybody may realize that the mainstream academia of strength training is still in the evidence-based framework for now.
I mean, that's why I think there's a lot of conflict. I think that a lot of the people who have traditionally been evidence-based, I think maybe that's why there's a lot of pushback against the new science-based lifters, because they are realizing that there's a disconnect between those two things.
I mean, that's why, when people make fun of some of the figureheads of the evidence-based strength training community, when they make fun of them for saying, we don't know why, kind of long muscle lengths cause more hypertrophy than short muscle lengths. We don't know. We don't know. They keep saying, we don't know. It's like what science-based lifters may not realize yet is that we don't know, as stated by an evidence-based practitioner, is the foundation of their faith. It's the foundation of their starting point. It's the foundation of their framework. They have to start with that, because otherwise they can't implement evidence-based approaches, because you would always do science instead, because science is better. You would never do evidence-based if you could do science, because science is always going to give you the better answer. And you would never do science if you can do engineering, because engineering is going to get you a better answer than science is. Because engineering actually has all the science baked into it already. So ultimately, when people are, kind of seeing these figureheads saying, we don't know why, it's like they have to say that. They have to say that, because otherwise you would default back to science and you go, well, actually, we do know. And that's what a lot of the influencers are now starting to do. They're saying, when they're hearing people say, "We don't know how stretch-mediated hypertrophy works," I'm like, "We do actually. It's just tighter." And that then what you've got is two groups of people talking past each other, because the evidence-based people can't hear that information. And that's really interesting, okay? Because they actually can't hear it. You can say it to them and it'll just go straight over them. Because if they heard it, then they would realize that what they're doing isn't applicable anymore. Because if you have a science-based explanation for something, then you don't need evidence, because science gives you the answer. Evidence is a second kind of option for you if you can't do science. And I think if people could just understand that, then I think we would see even more of a conflict happening between these two kind of areas. I mean, ultimately, I'm chill about it because it doesn't affect me, but I think there will be potentially a shift as the next generation of exercise scientists go into the academic community and they're expecting to do science. And the existing community is trying to get them to do evidence-based approaches. And there'll be a conflict there as the younger people coming through start to go, well, no, we want to do science. We want to understand how titin is affecting stretch-mediated hypertrophy. We don't want to just keep doing random studies yet again, testing whether or not long muscle lengths cause more muscle growth than short muscle lengths, and then adding them to the list of studies you've already got, and then doing a meta-analysis, because that's what's happening. They're just doing study after study after study, and then they do a meta-analysis, and that's evidence-based. That's all just evidence-based tactics. Whereas science is trying to figure out what actually happened, And that's again why you've got these disagreements between people who go, "Oh, I've got 13 meta-analyses that show that 2 times a week is the same as 3 times a week," and I'm like, "Dude, physiology tells me that can't possibly be true. So I don't care how many meta-analyses you've got, because I'm not doing evidence-based practice. I'm not trying to construct a whole, kind of list of studies and then arguing about I've got the most studies with the best statistical significance and the most meta-analyses. And I don't care, because I'm not doing that. That's not the game I'm playing. And gradually what we're going to see, I think, is as the younger people come through into the academic community and they want to do science instead of doing evidence-based approaches, that we'll see that starting to be, there'll be a conflict. And then, as you know, there'll be a resolution and they'll find a sort of some kind of approach to go forward, and hopefully they'll lean more on the science side. But I find human dynamics fascinating, as you know. I mean, it's just really, really interesting to watch.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, TikTok is kind of like the wild, wild west, but it's really interesting seeing that shift amongst younger lifters and the way they have embraced science, and seeing that power dynamic shift from what used to be seen as the previous authority, which was evidence based. And like you said, give it a few years, when those people start to enter the actual academia and research labs, it's going to be an interesting thing to observe for sure.
Yeah, and ultimately, science is a better tool for establishing the answer to these questions. It will always be more attractive to people. I think the confusion arises is where influencers try to confound the two, and they try and use evidence-based terminology when they're talking about science and vice versa. So, there's a bunch of influencers who they'll present themselves as science-based, but then they'll start using evidence-based tactics, and they'll say, well, all of these experts agree on this matter, or all of these studies say this thing, or this meta-analysis says that thing. Well, that's all evidence-based tactics. It's all evidence-based framework. It's all evidence-based approach. Science doesn't care whether you've got 1,000 experts who all say the same thing. Science doesn't care whether you've got 100 meta-analyses that all say the same thing. It doesn't care. All that science does is describe what is actually happening. And if you've got an understanding of what's actually happening and your meta-analyses say something different, then there's something wrong with your meta-analyses. And if you've got 1,000 experts that all say the same thing and one expert that says something different, but the expert that says something different actually understands what they're talking about, then your other 1,000 experts are wrong. It literally doesn't matter. It's like it either is or it isn't. We've got a lot of evidence-based stuff being used as if it were science. And I think it's going to be interesting to watch whether people can see that over time as they start to notice that a lot of their science, a lot of the older, more established, and I don't think this is true about the younger generation at all. As you say, I think the wild west of TikTok is definitely literally just arguing ideas, which is fantastic. It's like, is this true or is it not true? Whereas I think what you find with the older generation, the more established people, they're the ones that tend to go, oh, I've got 13 meta-analyses that show this thing. And I'm like, I don't care. Tell me how it works. Because you can't. Because you don't know. because you're not doing science, you're doing evidence-based approaches. Whereas you've got another person who's like, this is how it works, and the physiology works like this, and this is happening, and then this is happening. And it's like, yeah, that's exactly what's happening, clearly, because that's just physiology. And I think that's the really interesting kind of dynamic that we're starting to see. And that's ultimately the cause of the drama that I was part of last year, which everybody knows about, which ultimately came about because you've got evidence-based people saying, oh, the meta-analyses show that this is the case. And then the science approach says, well, that can't possibly be true. So what's the problem with those meta-analyses?
It is interesting because someone who is evidence-based isn't going to accept the scientific explanation because that's not evidence necessarily
Because
to
it would
them.
destroy the framework that they're living in.
Well, that too. Yeah, literally. You end up, like you said, you end up speaking past each other because you're not speaking the same language because what's actually meaningful to one person is meaningless to the other person.
Correct. The evidence-based framework assumes that science can't give an answer. It has to, otherwise you wouldn't use it. That's ultimately what it was designed to do. It was designed to step in and solve a problem where it goes back to evidence-based medicine as the beginning, because at that
Yeah.
time, and probably arguably, I'm not comment on it, but potentially arguably today, we don't have the Star Trek level technology to be able to do science at the level that we would need to do to understand how every single medical procedure and medical treatment is working at the time. And whether that's true today is a separate question. So evidence-based medicine came about because it was like, okay, well, what can we do instead? Well, we just test stuff and see what happens, and then we accumulate evidence for and against a particular treatment. And then you incorporate that into other areas, but you don't need to do that in strength training because science is already doing the answer for you.
I mean, that's a really good point. It's not, I don't know if you're saying this, what I'm hearing is not necessarily that evidence-based is, quote unquote bad or wrong or anything like that, but it is a second option when we
It's a
don't have,
horse and cart in the age of the automobile. It's
yes,
just simply outdated and unnecessary. You don't need it if you can do science.
if you can do science. And because for me personally, like, if I look at, say, you just talked about medicine, if I look at, say, some of the stuff on, say, supplementation or functional health, and there's some huge holes in some of that literature. And to the extent that I think we probably can't actually understand some of that stuff the way we would want to. And we do, I would say, have to rely on evidence-based
There you go.
outcomes in some of that stuff.
Totally
And so
valid.
I actually personally use that language for myself. I'll use language of being science-based or evidence-based, depending on what the topic is that I'm talking about. So in my mind, I'm making that distinction and I'm actually acknowledging at points in time, I'm being evidence-based here because either I don't know the science or I don't
Totally.
think we actually have access to that.
Totally. And there might be terrains that you can't use a vehicle on and you have to use a horse. I mean, it's
Mm.
like that. That's just how it is. It's like you can't go there in a car. There's no road, so you're on horseback. And that's exactly the same situation that we've got here. It's like you can navigate this terrain using evidence-based framework because that's the only one that's going to work. But you can navigate this one using science-based framework. So let's use that. And I think ultimately that's kind of the way I would urge people to consider it. Now, I'm interested to see where this goes, whether people pick me up on this or whether they just ignore it or whether they argue about it. It'd be really interesting to know. But that's the way that I think it works. So it'd be interesting to see what other people.
Yeah, interesting to see what the React videos are that we see in the coming week. Or more likely 10,000 word articles. To go back to specialization phases,
Yes.
what have we not covered so far?
I think we're there, actually. I think we got there. It's actually not hugely complicated. We just break it down into component variables. We've just got the variables that affect the way you're going to get to the maximum level of kind of muscle mass that you can obtain. It's just going to be down to recruitment and the neuromechanical matching side of things, the variety. And then on the rate of growth, you've just got the frequency and the volume. Now, frequency, we're kind of baking that in as being 3 times a week or every other day. And the volume then was the long diversion that we had about whether you can actually maximize workout volume or not, and depending on how you might approach it and all the various kind of ins and outs of that particular question. So, but yeah, that's how I would visualize it. Now, I'm not sure that then lends itself to a lot of different approaches. They're all going to have the same kind of characteristics. They're all going to be training, a high exercise variety with a high degree of recruitment multiple times per week. Beyond that, I think there's probably a number of ways of baking the cake.
Would you say depending on someone's experience level, maybe. So if I'm looking at a beginner, well, a beginner shouldn't be special, shouldn't. I would say I'm not going to set a specialization phase for a beginner. But say you've got someone who is a little bit earlier on in their lifting journey, then perhaps a goal of a specialization phase for them will be predominantly increasing the speed or the rate of muscle growth in that muscle, right? So in that instance, arguably the volume, frequency, where you place that exercise in that workout is going to be more important than necessarily a high exercise variety or some of those variables that are going to be more important for total muscle mass development, right? So would you think for someone who's maybe more intermediate compared to advanced, maybe the specialization phase might look a little bit different?
I don't know. I think you could take an advanced specialization phase and it would work for anybody. I mean, because ultimately you're dealing with the most limitations in that scenario. So you have to overcome all the hurdles. You have to fix everything and make it work for everybody. So I think you can
You
take
could
more
say
shots
that about anything advanced, really.
if it's done correctly. Now,
Yeah.
generally speaking, the industry historically has thrown all kinds of rubbish at advanced people that doesn't work at all. But yeah, the way we think about advanced people, yes, the advanced program has to be perfect because otherwise you're not going to make any progress. And so it will work for, the same person at a lower level of advancement. Yeah, so you can kind of get away with more mistakes, if you like, or compromises at the intermediate level. But, ultimately the same principles are still going to apply.
And my argument there, and maybe this comes down to how long someone's choosing to specialize for. So in my head, I'm thinking, 8 weeks, I'm along those lines. That's what I would sort of regard as maybe a somewhat standard duration for a specialization phase. But I understand maybe some people do much longer, whatever. I don't think there's a lot of value in doing a whole lot less than that. How long would you normally prescribe a specialization phase for?
Well, I'm not a huge fan of them, to be honest. And I
Mm,
think it depends on the individual and their circumstances. I think I look at specialization phases where, people clearly have a problem that they're trying to solve. So I don't like specialization phases where people just go, oh, I'm going to do a specialization phase because I feel like it. It's like, well, really? Why? Just carry on doing what you're doing. It's working and you're going to make gradual progress across the board and you're not rocking the boat. You're not messing things up. Whereas, if somebody's like, here I am, clearly I've got a serious, kind of lack of this particular development. And I'm like, yes, I agree with you. And it's like, okay, how do we fix that then? And then actually you've got to kind of start with, because the chances are that that person has got a deficit in that particular area
yeah.
for a specific reason. And the reason, if they are training with a degree of rigor and intelligence, the reason will be because they have no leverage.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you actually then have to look at your exercise selection. You have to figure and do the things that we've talked about. You have to get your
Yeah.
exercise variety on point. You have to get your motor unit recruitment high for the specific areas that you're trying to train. And then you have to train that rigorously multiple times per week for a period of time. And you'll notice what's happening. And when it stops, when it gets to you to the way you want to go, you stop. How long is a piece of string? Well, that's where you're going, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting sort of scenario context where one might use specialization phase, and it's probably not. I think a lot of people think that that's them, but I don't think it truly is a lot of the time. Like generally what people I think are doing are thinking, I have an ideal physique in mind and it looks like X. And so that physique in mind has, overdeveloped or largely developed biceps or chest or whatever. And
That's
so that's
fine.
what I want to
That's
specialize.
fine though. They've established that, but that's the same as what I'm saying.
Well, it's a little bit different in the sense that what you're saying then is like the exercise variety is going to help in terms of changing leverages. And I get that it will still potentially do that for this individual. But what I would argue in that case is if you've got a physique goal, then potentially does it not make sense just to, in your normal day-to-day training ongoing, decide these are the muscles that are more important to me. These are the muscles that are less important to me.
But
And
that's
essentially
just
just,
changing your normal routine into a specialization routine.
sure,
You're
but then it's
arguing
an ongoing one.
semantics, but that's just yeah, it just carries on until you get to where you're going, isn't it? I mean, you're saying the same thing as me. You're just changing the word.
Yeah, I guess so. I would say I kind of look at it as like high priority muscles and low priority muscles, right?
Yeah,
And
it's
so
just
I
the
would
same
say
thing.
most people are going to have probably maybe 3 high priority muscles, um, potentially more. And then there'll be a couple of low priority. I'd say there's normally going to be like 1 or 2 very low priority where someone doesn't really care that trainer directly.
Well, because this is useful because you're extending the applicability of what we're saying
Yes, because then
beyond.
it's not just a 6-week or 8-week phase. This is kind of how you build out a
This is
program for that
actually
individual
how you would build a program if you were trying to push your physique in a
priority
particular
muscle.
direction. Yeah,
Yeah.
push your phy So it's actually not just about specialization, it's about structuring your program towards a specific goal.
Yeah. So I do still use specialization phases. And the way, obviously, there's some scenarios like you've mentioned where they're going to be applicable, but I use them for general purposes. And I use them more as an opportunity to increase motor unit recruitment in a given muscle. And then I'll rotate that. So I'll have it as part of essentially like a balanced program. So it might be, okay, this is a program where I want overall development, fairly balanced development, male physique focus, whatever. And then I might have a period where, because like you've outlined before, we can't feasibly necessarily have unilateral work for every single muscle and clusters for every single muscle and whatever. So I'll include some of those exercises, some of those more motor unit enhancement, recruitment sort of exercises, methods for say 1 or 2 muscles at a time. And then I'll rotate that to something else. So the way I'm doing it generally is not, yes, there'll be some extra exercise variation to do that, but I'm looking at it more chasing a different adaptation in that muscle rather than necessarily speeding up the rate of growth or anything else. Does that make sense? Is there anything else we need to cover? I feel like we've gone down a lot of different paths today. So hopefully there's been something there for everyone. But I think you made a good point to conclude at the end there that while we veil this in the language of specialization phase, this is ultimately the same framework you're going to use for any high priority muscle, which you could include in your training ongoing. So if nothing else, I think that's a valuable way for someone to think about this if they are running programs. So thank you guys for joining us. As always, we appreciate all of you. Please like and share and comment and everything else. And we do hope you'll join us next week.